学生们好. This is the seventh and last of the seven lectures covering material in the introduction of Integrated Chinese Level 1, Part 1, 3rd edition. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the Chinese writing system. And I wanted, before we start, to note that this PowerPoint is based on one with few additions, based on one created by Huiru Zhuang from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I want to give a big shout out to UH for this. And you'll notice that in the past, some of the slides have also been from this. You can find the original slideshow up on the Integrated Chinese website if you'd like to look at it in its entirety. Okay, so we're going to start today and introduce aspects of the Chinese writing system. The Chinese writing system, there are 6 categories of Chinese characters. The first category are pictographs, and this is the one that Chinese is known most for, but it's actually a fairly small percentage of the Chinese characters. And these were developed from pictures, and here are 4 examples. The first one being sun. Here's a picture of a sun, and this is what it looked like in the earliest orthography, and you can see how over time it moved from being a circle with a dot or line in it to, in fact, being a very rectangle, a very clear rectangle with a line through it, pronounced sun. Similarly, moon, you can see how it developed from a crescent moon to a moon, still a crescent moon, but with a little line in it. This eventually looked like this and ended up like this. This is the modern character for moon. It also means month. It's pronounced yue. Cloud started out as being kind of a little swirl in the sky. It eventually developed into this character, and this is the traditional character for cloud, yun, and here is the simplified version of it. Yun. Last one, rain. You can see here how it looked like a picture of perhaps some kind of a shelter with the drops coming down, and this eventually developed into this. Here is the modern character for rain, yu. Okay, so these are pictographs, but we can only go so far with this. I mean, we can only develop pictures for so many. So as characters developed, different ways of forming characters also developed. Okay, and the second one is called self-explanatory. It really, 直视, the Chinese name really means pointing to things or pointing to matters, and that's what you're doing here. So, for example, 1, 2, and 3 were written 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines. That's not necessarily a picture of 1, 2, 3, but it points to it, right? It symbolizes or represents 1, 2, 3, and you can see the modern is still pretty much the same. Above and below, you had a line with a little dot or a little short line above it that has developed into this character here. You can see shang, right? You had a line with a little character with a little shorter line below it, and that is developed into this character here. Xia is below, okay, or under. So you can see how they're pointing to the idea, but they're not a picture. This third one is, again, putting ideas together. So here you can have what we call them associate. English translation is associative compounds. Literally, they're sort of grouped meanings. And so you have 2 pictographs. In this case, for example, sun and yue, moon. You put that together and you have a new character, ming, which means, what do you think it would mean? Bright, right? When you get the sun and moon together, it's going to be very bright. Okay. Another, and this is the fourth way of producing Chinese characters is represents the vast majority of Chinese characters, and they are pictophonetic. You'll have two pieces, okay? You will have a piece that stands for, that is a picture that represents the meaning, and you will have a phonetic piece that represents the sound. So this is by far the most common way in which Chinese characters were produced, by putting together a sound, a meaning part, and a sound part, and that would make a full character. Some examples of those, here is a whole bunch of characters that use this sound, qing, which originally, it's up here. Let me see if I can get here's my cursor. So here, this character, qing, means green, a type of green, pronounced qing. We add a sun to the sound qing, and we have qing, which is bright, which is fine, a sunny day, qing tian. We can add a sound or a speaking radical to it, and we have qing, which means please, or a request, qing qiu, to ask a request. So qing, and this is one of the first words we're going to learn, is qing. We add a heart, the meaning heart, to it, and we have qing, which means reason. Qing huang is a situation, so that qing. We add an I to it, and we get jing, again, so it's kind of close, jing, qing, right, are related, and this is jing, yen, jing, eyeball, okay, so that's part of I, yen, jing. We add the water meaning of water to it, and we have qing, which means pure, so qing shui, pure water. So that this is one example of how we would put we have the one sound, or somewhat sound, qing, this represents that sound, and all the different possibilities by adding different meanings to it. Okay. The last two ways of representing characters are used very seldom. You're not going to run into very many of them. Don't worry about it. An example that you will see is that we have the word lao, and you see you turn it around a little bit, and you get the sound kao, and that means to test. You have loan words, where you had a character that meant one thing, but another homophone, and you just use that character to represent the meaning of the homophone. So, for example, lai was originally meant something else. It now means to come. You'll see it more often. Hua, this character, was flower, but it also means to spend, because there was a word to spend, hua, that they just arbitrarily assigned the character for flower to it. So that's sort of how that phonetic loan characters work. When we, as I mentioned earlier, the most common way of producing characters, and the way that characters are organized in a dictionary, for example, is that there is a meaning part to it and a sound part to it. And they, over time, there have sort of been developed a standard 214 meaning parts, and we call these radicals, okay? So there is a chart to the right, and you can find in your textbook some more examples, or I think pretty fairly similar examples, of some common radicals. And the very first one here is person, and that is written slightly different when it's a radical, and we'll run into these over and over again. And so the reason we want to think about this, think about radicals, is because it helps us make some sense of what might look like a bunch of meaningless lines. So when you're familiar with the radicals, you can learn new characters more quickly, because you can identify what pieces you've seen before. And that is also the case when you start paying attention to common phonetic elements. They repeat themselves, and it helps you as you're memorizing these characters, because you can put these two pieces together, and it's kind of a clue to what it means, but also how to write it. You can remember how to write it that way. Speaking of writing, over time, the way that we write Chinese characters has also been standardized, and now there are these different types of strokes. A dot, and here is the character Yong, which represents all of them. So you have a dot here, a horizontal line, a vertical line, a downward left, downward right, upward, horizontal hook. Okay, so that is a horizontal hook. Excuse me. A vertical hook. So that would be, this is actually kind of a vertical hook, right? It's vertical, but it's also a hook. And a slanted hook, this here. A horizontal bend and a vertical bend. Okay, so horizontal bend and vertical bend. We'll see more characters in a second. So there, in addition to it being standardized that there are those strokes, okay, there are also guidelines for stroke order. And this is really important to pay attention to, because it helps you memorize how to write them. If you write them the same way every time, for one thing, the character will look nicer. It will look like it's meant to look, but it will also train your hand to do the same thing over and over again. In other words, you're cultivating muscle memory so that you can then eventually write characters without even thinking about them. You've just gotten them so that your hand automatically writes them and you don't have to think about it. But to do that, you really have to write them. You have to practice. You have to practice a lot, but you have to practice them in the same way every time so that your muscles know what to do. It's very much like learning a sport of some kind or learning how to dance. You have to train your body to move in a certain way, and one of the ways you do that is by over and over and over again, but making exactly the same movement, and that's where it becomes important. So let's look more slowly at the guidelines for stroke order. We have left to right, top to bottom, horizontal before vertical, from outside to inside, middle before two sides, and inside before closing. Let's look at some examples. So, left to right, the character 1 is a good example of left to right. The character ba for 8 is also a good example of left to right. Okay. Another rule, top to bottom. The character R2 is a good example of top to bottom. The first line goes first, the top line goes first, the second line goes second, top to bottom. One more time watching that. From top to bottom, the character Leo, 6, is also a good example of top to bottom. So that's both top to bottom, left to right, and you see how both of these work together. So left to right, top to bottom. Okay. Horizontal before vertical. This is the character Shi for 10. Horizontal before vertical. Let's watch it one more time. Horizontal, vertical. Okay. This is the character 1 to ask, and we go from outside to inside. One more time. Outside to inside. Okay. Middle before two sides. This is the character xiao, small. And you do the middle first and the two sides. And you notice that the sides are identical, and that's how you know that it's middle before two sides. Usually it's going to be a situation where the two sides are equal and identical, and there's something different in the middle. One more time. Middle, then two sides. Middle before closing. So this is the character, right? We've seen this already, sun. and middle before closing it up. Okay, one more. This is the character S for 4. Middle, and then we close it up. So outside first, that's that rule, outside to inside, but then middle, then you close it up. One more time. Outside, middle, before closing. Okay, now to practice. One way that you can practice is by writing the numbers for 1 to 10. And we will be tested on that in our final quiz of the introduction unit. And if you want to practice, you have them in your character workbook, but you can also go to the Lost Theory Animated Characters page. And you can look up the numbers. Oh, we got countries, sorry, numbers. And you can start down and go through the numbers 0, which is represented by a 0 in simplified, to 10. So we have E1. Remember, we talked about that from left to right. And we can keep going, but you can do that on your own. Practice writing the characters 1 to 10 as a way of practicing stroke order and your first and also your first 10 characters. All right, so this is the end of the 7th lecture covering the materials of that are in the introduction of Integrated Chinese Level 1, Part 1, First Edition, and we'll be seeing more of these little mini lectures about various different grammar patterns as we run into them in lessons 1 through 8 this semester.